If a grandmother gives her grandson a birthday gift, is that love or manipulation? That was the sentence Emily Whitmore said out loud in the middle of the living room. And for a moment the entire birthday party went quiet, as if someone had turned off the sound in the house. It was a warm Saturday afternoon in early June, the kind of day when sunlight spills through the kitchen windows and the smell of vanilla cake drifts through every hallway. 8-year-old Lucas Whitmore was celebrating his birthday, surrounded by balloons, paper plates, and a handful of relatives gathered around the dining table. His grandmother, Margaret Whitmore, had arrived early that morning carrying a carefully wrapped box no bigger than a shoebox. Margaret was 71 years old, a widow who had spent most of her life in the same quiet neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio. She had raised her son Daniel with the kind of patience that comes from long days and small sacrifices, and now that Daniel had his own family, Margaret believed her role was simple: show up when invited, bring kindness when she could, and never become a burden. She stood near the end of the table as Lucas tore open the wrapping paper, his excitement filling the room in a way only a child's joy can. Inside the box was a small beginner's telescope, polished black with silver trim, the kind designed for children curious about the stars. Lucas's eyes widened instantly. He lifted it carefully, as if it were something fragile and magical at the same time. "Grandma, this is amazing," he said, his voice full of wonder. Margaret smiled softly, the way people do when months of quiet planning finally turn into a simple moment of happiness. She had saved for that telescope for nearly 5 months, setting aside a little money each week from the part-time bookkeeping she still did for a local hardware store. Lucas had once told her during a backyard visit that he wanted to see the moon up close someday. Margaret never forgot that sentence. But before Lucas could say another word, Emily Whitmore set down her coffee cup on the counter with a sharp sound that cut through the cheerful noise of the party. Emily was 36, polished and confident, the kind of woman who organized every detail of family life with careful precision. She looked at the telescope, then at Margaret, and her expression hardened in a way that made the room feel suddenly smaller. "Of course you'd give him that," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You always do things like this." Several relatives glanced at one another, unsure if she was joking. Margaret's smile faded slightly, but she remained still, her hands folded calmly in front of her. Emily crossed her arms and shook her head. "Let's just say it honestly," she continued. "This isn't about a gift. It's about manipulation." The word hung in the air like smoke after a candle is blown out. Lucas looked confused, his small fingers still gripping the telescope. Daniel Whitmore, Margaret's son, shifted his weight beside the table but said nothing. Margaret noticed the silence more than the accusation. She noticed the way people suddenly avoided eye contact, the way the cheerful music from the kitchen radio suddenly sounded too loud for the room. She walked slowly toward Lucas and gently adjusted the strap on the telescope's carrying case so it rested comfortably on his shoulder. "It's yours, sweetheart," she said quietly. "Use it to look at the moon whenever you want." Lucas nodded, still uncertain why the atmosphere had changed. Margaret then stepped back toward the window where the sunlight touched the floorboards. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. At 71 years old, Margaret Whitmore had learned that sometimes the most revealing moments in a family are not the loud ones, but the quiet ones that follow a single unexpected sentence. The room did not return to its cheerful rhythm after Emily said that word. The music from the small kitchen radio kept playing an old country song, but nobody seemed to be listening anymore. Lucas stood quietly beside the dining table holding the telescope box, glancing between his mother and his grandmother as if trying to understand whether he had done something wrong. Margaret Whitmore noticed the confusion in the boy's eyes before she noticed anything else. She gently rested her hand on his shoulder and gave him a small, reassuring smile. "Why don't you take it outside later tonight?" she said softly. "If the sky is clear, you might see the moon very bright." Lucas nodded slowly, but the excitement that had filled the room only minutes earlier had faded into an awkward stillness. Emily Whitmore remained standing near the kitchen counter, her arms folded tightly as if she had already decided that the conversation was finished. She glanced at the telescope again with the same sharp expression that had crossed her face moments earlier. "Lucas already has plenty of things," she said in a calm but firm voice. "We try to keep gifts simple in this house." A few relatives shifted in their seats, pretending to focus on their cake plates. Daniel Whitmore rubbed the back of his neck and avoided looking directly at anyone. Margaret noticed that silence as well. Over the years, she had learned that silence in a family gathering often revealed more than words ever could. Still, she did not raise her voice. She simply nodded once and stepped away from the table, walking slowly toward the wide window that looked out onto the backyard. The afternoon sunlight was warm on the wooden floorboards, and through the glass, she could see Lucas's small basketball hoop near the fence where Daniel used to practice free throws when he was a boy. Margaret remembered those afternoons clearly, when Daniel would run into the house asking for lemonade and telling her about every shot he made. Back then, the house had always felt full of laughter. She wondered quietly when that feeling had started to disappear. Behind her, the party slowly resumed in cautious fragments. Someone began slicing the birthday cake. Paper plates were passed around the table. Lucas carefully set the telescope back in its box and placed it beside his chair as if it were something fragile. Emily moved closer to Daniel and spoke to him in a lower voice that only a few people could hear. Margaret did not try to listen, but she noticed the way Daniel's shoulders tightened as he nodded. A few minutes later, Lucas approached his grandmother again, holding the box with both hands. "Grandma," he said gently, "are you sure it is okay if I keep it?" Margaret looked down at him with calm eyes that had seen many seasons of family life. "Of course it is," she replied. "A gift is meant to be used, not hidden." Lucas smiled faintly and returned to the table, but the earlier excitement never fully returned. Margaret stood quietly near the window, watching the sunlight shift across the yard. At 71 years old, she had experienced enough family gatherings to recognize when something deeper was unfolding beneath ordinary words. Emily's accusation had not come out of nowhere. It had the tone of something rehearsed, something that had been forming quietly long before that afternoon. Margaret did not argue, and she did not defend herself in front of everyone. Instead, she observed the room the way a patient person observes the weather, noticing the small changes in expression, the quick glances between relatives, the way Daniel remained unusually quiet. In that moment, Margaret Whitmore understood something important. The telescope had never really been the problem. Margaret Whitmore did not stay long after the candles were blown out. She waited until Lucas finished his cake, until the boy laughed again with a few cousins in the backyard, and then she quietly picked up her purse from the chair near the hallway. No one stopped her at first. The house had returned to its usual rhythm, but it felt thinner somehow, like a room where the air had slowly escaped through a small crack in the wall. Daniel walked her to the front door, his steps hesitant on the hardwood floor. For a moment, he looked like the same boy who used to stand beside her in the grocery store aisle deciding between two brands of cereal. Now he was 42 years old, a father, a homeowner, a man responsible for keeping peace inside his own house. "Mom," he said softly. Emily did not mean it the way it sounded. Margaret studied his face with the patience that comes from decades of motherhood. She could see the familiar conflict behind his eyes, the quiet calculation of someone trying to keep everyone comfortable at the same time. "It sounded exactly the way she meant it," Margaret replied gently. Her voice was calm, not angry, which somehow made Daniel more uncomfortable. He opened the door and the warm Ohio evening drifted in from the porch, carrying the smell of freshly cut grass from a neighbor's yard. Margaret stepped outside and paused beside the railing where a row of small flower pots lined the wooden steps. She had given Emily those pots 3 summers ago when the family first moved into this house. At the time, Emily had thanked her politely, but the gratitude had felt formal, like something rehearsed rather than sincere. Daniel leaned against the doorframe and looked down the quiet suburban street where children rode bicycles past. Neatly trimmed lawns. "Things have just been stressful lately," he said, searching for a simple explanation that might smooth over the afternoon. Margaret nodded once, but she did not respond right away. Instead, she watched Lucas through the living room window. The boy was kneeling on the carpet, carefully opening the telescope box again, while another child looked over his shoulder with curiosity. Lucas's face still carried the bright concentration of someone discovering something new. Margaret felt a quiet warmth in her chest at the sight, mixed with something heavier she could not ignore anymore. "Daniel," she said slowly, "has Emily been saying things like that before today?" The question lingered in the evening air longer than Daniel expected. He shifted his weight and glanced back into the house, as if making sure no one else was listening. For a moment he did not answer. That silence told Margaret more than words would have. Finally, he cleared his throat. She just worries sometimes, he said carefully. She thinks too many gifts can make Lucas depend on people. Margaret did not argue, but she recognized the careful phrasing immediately. She had spent years balancing budgets and reviewing paperwork, and she understood the difference between a statement and a justification. As Daniel spoke, a few scattered memories quietly rearranged themselves in her mind, like puzzle pieces sliding into place. The canceled visits over the past 2 years. The sudden changes in holiday plans. The polite but firm messages from Emily explaining that Lucas was busy with school activities whenever Margaret suggested spending an afternoon together. At the time, Margaret had accepted those explanations without question. Now they looked different. The front door behind Daniel remained half open, and from inside the house Margaret could hear Emily's voice drifting through the kitchen as she spoke to one of the relatives. The tones sounded light and friendly again, as if nothing uncomfortable had happened at all. Margaret rested her hand on the porch railing and looked once more through the window at Lucas examining the telescope with quiet fascination. She realized something important in that moment. Emily had not reacted to the gift with surprise. She had reacted with certainty, as if she had already decided what that gesture meant long before the wrapping paper came off the box. Margaret Whitmore had lived long enough to recognize when a moment was not simply about what had just happened, but about something that had been building quietly in the background for a very long time. Margaret Whitmore drove home slowly that evening, her hands steady on the steering wheel as the quiet suburban streets of Columbus passed beneath the fading orange light of sunset. The drive from Daniel's house to her small ranch-style home usually took 20 minutes, but that night she noticed every stop sign and every familiar corner as if the neighborhood itself had grown quieter. When she pulled into her driveway, the porch light was already glowing softly, turning the white siding of the house into a pale gold color. She stepped inside and placed her purse on the small wooden table near the door, the same table that had stood there for more than 20 years. The house was silent except for the gentle ticking of the wall clock in the living room. Margaret did not turn on the television. Instead, she walked to the kitchen, filled a kettle with water, and placed it on the stove the way she had done nearly every evening since her husband passed away 3 years earlier. Small routines helped keep life steady. While the kettle warmed, Margaret stood by the window above the sink and watched the sky slowly darken. The memory of the afternoon replayed itself calmly in her mind, not as an argument, but as a series of small details she had not fully noticed before. Emily's tone had not sounded surprised. It had sounded prepared. That difference mattered. Margaret poured the hot water into a blue ceramic mug and carried it into the living room where a few old photo albums rested on the coffee table. She opened one of them without really thinking about it. Inside were photographs from years earlier, long before Daniel married Emily. There was Daniel at 12 years old standing beside a fishing boat with his father, holding up a bass nearly as long as his arm. There was another picture of Daniel sitting at the same kitchen table Margaret now used every morning, working on a science project about the planets. Margaret remembered that project clearly. Daniel had stayed up past 10 o'clock building a cardboard model of the solar system. She had helped him paint the tiny foam planets while he asked endless questions about Saturn and Jupiter. When Margaret saw Lucas holding that telescope earlier that afternoon, she had remembered Daniel's excitement from that same project. The connection had felt natural to her. But now she wondered if Emily had seen something entirely different in that moment. Margaret closed the photo album slowly and leaned back in her chair. Over the past 2 years there had been other small moments she had quietly ignored. Holidays that became shorter visits. Phone calls that went to voicemail more often than before. Invitations that seemed to arrive later and later each time. None of those moments had felt dramatic enough to question at the time. Families change, she had told herself. People become busy. Yet now those memories began to align in a way that made the pattern clearer. Emily had never openly argued with Margaret before, but she had gradually tightened the space around Lucas, like someone carefully adjusting the boundaries of a room. Margaret lifted the mug and took a slow sip of tea, feeling the warmth settle into her hands. She was not angry. At 71 years old, anger rarely lasted long in her life anymore. What remained instead was curiosity and a quiet determination to understand the truth of what had been unfolding inside her son's household. Outside the living room window, the evening sky had turned deep blue, and the first faint star appeared above the rooftops of the neighborhood. Margaret noticed it immediately. For a brief moment, she imagined Lucas stepping into his backyard later that night, pointing the telescope upward and searching for that same small light. The thought made her smile gently, but it also confirmed something important. If Emily truly believed a simple gift could control a child's loyalty, then the conflict inside that family was not about generosity at all. It was about something far more deliberate that Margaret Whitmore had only just begun to see. The next morning, Margaret Whitmore woke before sunrise, something she had done almost every day for the past 30 years. Habit had a way of staying even after the reasons for it disappeared. She walked into the kitchen, turned on the small lamp above the counter, and began preparing her morning coffee while the quiet house slowly filled with the soft sounds of an ordinary day beginning. Outside, the neighborhood was still and cool, with a thin layer of morning mist hanging above the lawns. Margaret carried her mug to the dining table where she usually read the newspaper, but that morning she did not open it. Her thoughts returned instead to the small details from the previous afternoon. She remembered the look on Lucas's face when he first opened the telescope. She remembered the sudden change in Emily's voice. And most of all, she remembered Daniel's hesitation when she asked whether Emily had spoken that way before. That hesitation stayed with her longer than the accusation itself. Margaret had spent many years working quietly as a bookkeeper, reviewing financial records for small businesses around Columbus. The job had taught her something simple but valuable. Patterns reveal themselves slowly, rarely in a single moment, but through repeated signals that begin to line up when someone finally decides to look closely. As she sat at the table, Margaret began to notice those signals again in her memory. About 6 months earlier, she had tried to take Lucas to the Science Museum downtown. He had been excited about a planetarium show, but the plan had been canceled the evening before with a polite message explaining that Lucas suddenly had too much homework. 2 months after that, she had mailed him a set of astronomy books for children, only to receive a careful note from Emily thanking her, but suggesting that Lucas already had enough reading material for the school year. At the time, Margaret had accepted those explanations without question. Parents were busy. Children had schedules. That was normal life. But now those small events looked different when placed beside what happened at the birthday party. Margaret finished her coffee and carried the mug to the sink. As she rinsed it under warm water, she realized something else she had overlooked. Emily had not asked Lucas whether he wanted the telescope. She had immediately questioned Margaret's intention. That distinction mattered more than the gift itself. It suggested that Emily had already decided what role Margaret was allowed to play in Lucas's life. The thought did not make Margaret angry. Instead, it made her thoughtful in the quiet way that comes from long experience. She dried her hands on a kitchen towel and walked to the small desk in the corner of the living room where she kept her mail and personal papers neatly organized. On top of the stack was a letter she had received 2 weeks earlier from a financial advisor regarding the small investment account she had opened after selling the old fishing cabin that once belonged to her husband. Margaret had not yet decided what to do with that money. She had simply placed the letter aside, planning to think about it later. Now she picked it up again and read the first paragraph slowly. The account was modest but stable, enough to support a long-term education fund if she chose to structure it that way. Margaret folded the letter carefully and set it back on the desk. Through the living room window, she could see the pale morning sky brightening above the rooftops, and for a moment she imagined Lucas again standing in the backyard with the telescope pointed toward the moon. She hoped he had been able to try it the night before. Margaret Whitmore understood something clearly now. The conflict inside her son's household was not going to disappear with a single conversation. It had been growing quietly for years, shaped by assumptions and fears that had never been spoken openly. And if Emily truly believed that affection from a grandmother could be mistaken for manipulation, then Margaret realized she would need to be thoughtful about the next choices she made, because sometimes the calmest decisions carried the greatest consequences. 2 days passed quietly after Margaret Whitmore reviewed the letter on her desk, but the idea it carried remained in her thoughts like a steady echo. She continued her usual routines, answering a few bookkeeping emails for the hardware store, watering the small flower garden behind her house, and taking a slow walk around the neighborhood each afternoon. To anyone passing by, her life looked exactly the same as it had the week before. Yet inside her mind something had shifted from simple reflection to careful planning. Margaret had always believed that patience revealed truth more clearly than confrontation. Instead of calling Daniel or attempting to explain herself to Emily, she decided to gather more information before taking any step that might change the balance inside the family. On Thursday morning, she drove downtown to a quiet brick office building where her financial advisor worked. The office sat on the second floor above a small insurance agency, and the hallway smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper files. Margaret had visited that office only twice before, once when she sold the fishing cabin, after her husband passed away, and again when she first opened the investment account. The receptionist greeted her politely and offered coffee while she waited. Margaret sat in a leather chair near the window and looked out at the busy street below, where people moved quickly between office buildings. After a few minutes, her advisor, Mr. Leonard Carter, invited her into his office. Leonard was a calm man in his early 60s who had spent most of his career helping families plan for long-term savings. He remembered Margaret immediately and asked how she had been adjusting since selling the cabin. Margaret answered honestly that life had been peaceful, but she had begun thinking more seriously about Lucas's future. Leonard opened a folder containing the details of her account and explained the options available if she wanted to establish a structured education fund. He described how certain trusts could be arranged so the money would remain protected until the child reached adulthood, with clear conditions about who could manage or influence the account before that time. Margaret listened carefully without interrupting, occasionally asking precise questions the way she had done during her bookkeeping years. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. By the end of it, Leonard printed several documents outlining how such a trust could work, including a clause that allowed the account to be administered independently from parental control if the grantor preferred that structure. Margaret thanked him, folded the papers neatly into her purse, and walked back through the hallway toward the elevator. Outside the building, the afternoon sunlight reflected off the windows of nearby shops, and traffic moved steadily along the street. As she drove home, she felt the same calm focus she used to feel when balancing complicated financial records late at night. Nothing about her decision was emotional. It was simply practical. If Emily believed affection from a grandmother could be mistaken for influence, then the most responsible thing Margaret could do was remove any possible confusion. When she returned to her house, she placed the new documents beside the earlier letter on her desk and sat quietly for several minutes. Through the window, she could see the sky beginning to soften toward evening. Somewhere across town, Lucas Whitmore was probably finishing his homework or playing in the backyard. Margaret hoped he had used the telescope again. The thought made her smile faintly, but it also strengthened the quiet conclusion forming in her mind. Love did not require control, and if she truly wanted Lucas to benefit from what she could offer him in the future, she would need to make sure that generosity could never again be mistaken for manipulation. 3 days later, Margaret Whitmore made a decision that felt both simple and significant. She called Daniel on a quiet Sunday afternoon while she was sitting at the small desk in her living room. The sunlight coming through the window cast long lines across the wooden floor, and for a moment she watched the dust move slowly through the air before Daniel answered the phone. His voice sounded tired but calm. Margaret asked how Lucas was doing in school, and Daniel told her the boy had been excited about science class that week. He mentioned that Lucas had tried the telescope in the backyard and had spent nearly an hour looking at the moon and the bright points of light around it. Hearing that made Margaret smile softly. After a moment, she told Daniel she would like to visit the following weekend and bring Lucas something simple to help him learn more about the night sky. Daniel hesitated for a second before answering. The pause was brief but noticeable. Finally, he said that would probably be fine, but Emily had been trying to keep weekends structured for Lucas's activities. Margaret thanked him politely and ended the call without pressing further. When she set the phone down, she did not feel surprised. Instead, she felt a quiet confirmation of what she had already begun to understand. Later that same week, she returned to Leonard Carter's office with the documents they had discussed. The afternoon meeting was brief because Margaret had already made up her mind. Leonard reviewed the structure of the education trust one more time and explained how it would protect the funds until Lucas reached adulthood. The account would remain legally independent, meaning no one could redirect or withdraw the money before that time. Margaret listened carefully and signed the final paperwork with steady hands. When she finished, Leonard placed the documents in a secure folder and explained that the trust would become active immediately. As Margaret left the office building, she felt a sense of calm clarity that reminded her of the moment when a complicated ledger finally balances after hours of careful work. She had not created the trust as a form of punishment or retaliation. Instead, she saw it as a way of removing the misunderstanding that had grown around her intentions. If Emily believed gifts carried hidden expectations, then Margaret would ensure that Lucas's future support would arrive without any possible influence attached to it. That evening, Margaret sat on her back porch as the sky slowly darkened above the neighborhood. The air was cool and still, and one by one the stars began to appear across the wide stretch of sky. She imagined Lucas standing somewhere beneath the same sky, adjusting the telescope lens and searching patiently for the moon's pale surface. Children rarely see the conflicts that exist between adults, she thought, and perhaps that was a blessing. Lucas only saw a grandmother who encouraged his curiosity and a small telescope that helped him look farther than he had before. Margaret rested her hands quietly on the porch railing and allowed the silence to settle around her. Whatever tension existed between herself and Emily would eventually reveal its true shape in time. Until then, Margaret had done the one thing she knew would always remain clear. She had made sure that Lucas's future would never depend on anyone misunderstanding the meaning of her kindness. The following week passed with a calm rhythm that made the earlier tension feel distant. But Margaret Whitmore understood that quiet periods inside a family rarely meant problems had disappeared. They simply meant the story had moved to another stage. On Friday evening, Daniel called unexpectedly while Margaret was finishing dinner in her kitchen. His voice carried a mixture of relief and uncertainty. He explained that Lucas had been using the telescope almost every clear night since the birthday party. The boy had even brought a small notebook outside to sketch the shapes he thought he saw on the surface of the moon. Margaret listened with genuine warmth as Daniel described Lucas's excitement. She asked a few simple questions about school and his science class, careful not to bring up the conversation that had happened at the party. After a moment, Daniel hesitated again and said that Emily had been unusually quiet about the telescope during the past few days. That detail did not surprise Margaret. People who make strong accusations often prefer silence when the situation does not unfold the way they expected. Margaret thanked Daniel for the update and wished Lucas a good weekend before ending the call. The next morning, she drove to a small bookstore near the town square where she had once taken Daniel when he was a child. The shop had not changed very much over the years. Wooden shelves lined the walls, and a narrow ladder leaned against a tall section filled with reference books. Margaret walked slowly through the science section until she found a beginner guide to astronomy written for children. The book contained clear diagrams of the moon's surface and simple explanations about the brightest planets visible from North America. She held the book in her hands for a moment, remembering the nights Daniel used to ask questions about the stars while they sat together in the backyard. Eventually, she purchased the book and asked the cashier to wrap it in plain brown paper. As she stepped outside the store, the autumn air carried the faint scent of fallen leaves drifting along the sidewalk. Later that afternoon, Margaret placed the wrapped book on the desk in her living room beside the folder containing the trust documents she had signed earlier in the week. She looked at both objects quietly, recognizing how different they represented her role in Lucas's life. One gift was simple and immediate, meant to encourage curiosity. The other was patient and distant, designed to support a future he had not yet reached. Margaret did not see any contradiction between the two. Kindness could exist in both forms. As evening arrived, she carried a chair onto her back porch and sat beneath the deepening sky. The first stars appeared slowly above the rooftops, scattered across the darkness like distant lanterns. Somewhere across town, Lucas might have been adjusting the telescope again, turning the small dial until the blurry glow of the moon sharpened into focus. Margaret imagined his quiet concentration and felt a calm certainty settle within her. Whatever misunderstandings existed between the adults and the family, Lucas's curiosity remained untouched by those tensions. And in the long, quiet years ahead, Margaret Whitmore knew that curiosity would matter far more than any accusation spoken in a crowded living room. 2 weeks later, the air over Columbus carried the first clear signs of autumn, and the evenings arrived earlier than they had only a month before. Margaret Whitmore noticed the change one Saturday afternoon while she wrapped the astronomy book she had purchased from the small bookstore near the town square. She used simple brown paper and tied it with a thin piece of blue ribbon she had kept in a kitchen drawer for years. The package rested lightly in her hands as she drove toward Daniel's house, the quiet suburban streets familiar after decades of living in the same part of the city. When she arrived, Lucas was already in the backyard adjusting the small telescope on the wooden deck. His concentration was so intense that he did not notice Margaret until Daniel called his name from the porch. Lucas turned immediately and ran toward her with the open excitement children rarely try to hide. He told her he had already learned how to find the moon, and one bright planet his teacher said might be Jupiter. Margaret listened with patient interest as he described everything he had seen through the lens. Emily stood near the sliding glass door, watching the conversation unfold. Her expression was calm, but there was a distance in her posture that had not existed before the birthday party. Margaret greeted her politely and handed Lucas the wrapped book without ceremony. Lucas opened it on the porch steps and began flipping through the pages filled with star charts and simple diagrams. Daniel leaned over to look as well, smiling when Lucas pointed to a picture of the moon's craters. For several minutes the four of them stood together in an unexpected moment of quiet cooperation. The conversation remained focused on planets, constellations, and the best time of night to see the brightest stars above Ohio. Eventually Emily spoke, her voice measured but less sharp than Margaret remembered from the party. She said Lucas had been talking about the telescope every day at dinner and had even asked his teacher how astronauts travel beyond Earth's orbit. Margaret nodded gently and told Lucas that curiosity was the best reason to look up at the sky. As evening approached, Daniel lit the small porch light, but Lucas insisted on waiting until darkness settled so he could try the telescope again. Margaret sat in a chair nearby, while Lucas carefully adjusted the focus dial the way he had practiced during the past week. The moon rose slowly above the rooftops, pale and round against the deep blue sky. Lucas leaned into the eyepiece and gasped with quiet amazement when the surface came into focus. After a moment, he stepped back and invited Margaret to look as well. She bent slightly and gazed through the small lens, seeing the familiar bright craters shining across the moon's surface. When she straightened, Lucas asked the question that had been lingering in his mind since the birthday party. He wondered whether it was really wrong for a grandmother to give a gift like the telescope. Margaret looked down at him with the same calm warmth she had carried through every stage of the story. She told him that gifts are simply small ways people share what they care about with someone else. Sometimes adults misunderstand those gestures, but curiosity and kindness are never mistakes. Lucas nodded thoughtfully and returned to the telescope, searching again for the bright points of light scattered across the sky. Margaret watched quietly from the porch.